Good morning. I'm Sarita Brown, President of Excelencia in Education, and on behalf of everyone who has worked hard to bring this new piece of analysis to you today, we welcome you. This event is the extension of a fascinating conversation. But before I tell you about that conversation, most of you are familiar, but in case there's anyone in the room who does not know Excelencia in Education, our mission is accelerating Latino student success in higher education. And we do that because a country's most precious resource is its human resource. Education is key to the development of that human resource, and that is why we are proud to have led the country's efforts to increase Latino college attainment. As we do our work, we engage America's colleges and universities because it is through their institutions that today's Latino students must pass to assume their future in the workplace and in civic leadership. Now that was the soapbox speech, that was the backdrop that served as the context for a really interesting conversation that began with Gilbert Cisneros, the president of the Gilbert and Jacki Cisneros Foundation, DEBORAH Santiago, co-founder of Excelencia in Education, and myself about 24 months ago. That conversation included things like what happens to Latino students who go to selective institutions, the vexing question of what happens with high-achieving Latino students who choose to enroll in open access, non-selective institutions. And does this choice impact their success? These were questions that were not just philosophical, but they were burning because they were about how we together are going to serve Latino students and ensure that they graduate. The conversation went further. It went into commitment and action. And all of that led to a project which today we share with you in the form of this brief, From Selectivity to Success, Latinos at Selective Institutions, supported by the Gilbert and Jacki Cisneros Foundation. By itself, that's an achievement. But to have assembled the panel that will engage in discussion right now is equally important. And I'm going to depart from my normal, here's their title, here's what they are, here's their email, here's the Twitter tag, and I'm going to give you a little bit more information about them, and I'll do it in the order in which they'll speak. The first speaker is DEBORAH Santiago, co-founder, COO, and Vice President for Policy at Excelencia in Education. For more than 20 years, she has led research and policy efforts for communities, national and federal level improvement efforts focused on educational opportunities and success for all students. She applies a really rare combination of skills to her fearless work: analytical thinking, deep knowledge of data, and effective public communications in English and in Spanish. And she brings all of that to frame the issues of higher education and inform the public about the current condition using a Latino lens. Because of that capacity, she is cited in numerous publications, including The Economist, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Chronicle for Higher Education, and most recently, DEBORAH was included in a group that was advising NBC as they sought to look at the issues of Latinos and this country and frame them for the future. Not that she has a lot of spare time, but she generously shares it with many and includes serving on the National Student Clearinghouse Board and the advisory board for the DREAM US and Univision's education campaign. Following her will be Gilbert Cisneros, president and co-founder of the Gilbert and Jacki Cisneros Foundation, an organization committed to improving the level of education for Hispanic students in this country. Gilbert, along with his wife Jacki, have become advocates for education in the Hispanic community. In a few short years, he has worked to create and promote a variety of educational programs to help Hispanic students become more competitive in the college selection process. I hope you picked up a copy of his bio so you can learn all of the wonderful things that he's been doing. But one of the things that I think captures a lot of people's attention is that Gilbert's dedication to philanthropy began because he purchased a winning California Mega Millions lottery ticket in 2010. By itself, that's exciting, and you want to ask him what did it feel like and all the rest of it. But one of the things that we, Deborah and I, are most moved by is that having achieved that, he pivoted and started to invest in education. He and Jacki have devoted their time and energies to becoming thoughtful philanthropists, initially making donations to their alma maters to endow scholarships for Hispanic students at George Washington University, the University of Southern California, and the Navy Supply Corps Foundation. In 2010, they formed the Gilbert and Jacki Cisneros Foundation. If you look at his resume, you'll see his education includes master's degrees. One of the things that I'm very proud of him to have achieved is a master's degree from Brown University in urban education policy very recently, after he founded the foundation. That displays the kind of deep commitment to care and purpose in terms of how that foundation will make investments in education. Following Gil will be Michele Siqueiros. As president for the Campaign for College Opportunity, Michele works to expand access and success in college for California students. Under her leadership, the campaign has assembled a statewide network of over 12,000 coalition supporters, involved over 50,000 young people and their families through the Save Me a Spot in College and I'm 1 in a Million scholarship, and released reports on the impact of California economy and educated workforce needs, sponsored and passed legislation to increase access to Pell Grants and promote college awareness. And very recently, she has been involved in leading the effort with the historic investment in transfer reform to make it easier for students to transfer from California community colleges to the California State University. Deborah and I have been very privileged to have her as a colleague literally from the time we founded Excelencia to now. She is the first in her family to graduate from college, and she has dedicated her career to advising local policymakers and catalyzing and managing organizational and systems change to serve her community. And our final speaker is someone that we at Excelencia in Education are coming to know, and that is Representative Raul Ruiz, who we do hope will be in the room shortly. He grew up in Coachella, California, where both his parents were farm workers. Dr. Ruiz, a practicing physician, started his education at Coachella Valley High School, a public high school. He went on for his undergraduate training, graduating with a degree magna cum laude from the University of California, Los Angeles. He followed that by going to Harvard, where he earned his medical degree, a master's of public policy from the Kennedy School of Government, and a master's of public health from the School of Public Health. That achievement made him the first Latino to earn 3 graduate degrees from Harvard University. By itself, quite significant, but someone who is sustained by a commitment to community and family. He returned to Coachella to begin his career as a physician, as an emergency room doctor. Recognizing that the physician shortage was affecting his community, Dr. Ruiz started a pre-medical mentorship program for young aspiring doctors, which grew to include over 100 local students and is now part of the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine, where Dr. Ruiz serves as a senior associate dean. Looking on the website and getting to know him better, you will see the breadth of his commitment, the depth of the energies which he has bestowed on his community, as well as work overseas. And then he decided to run for Congress. Dr. Ruiz was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2012. We bring to you analysis on the role of selective institutions. We bring to you a panel engaged in the Latino community and deeply committed to education. With all of this as introduction, it is my distinct pleasure to turn things over to Deborah Santiago.
Good morning, everyone. So I get to be the one who gives you the facts, and then you can hear the stories elsewhere. It's been a longer than expected process going through and taking a look at what's the story we want to tell as we think about Latinos at selective institutions. So much of the conversation that we have in DC and elsewhere is focused on Latinos who are at open access institutions, community colleges, four-year institutions that don't have any admissions criteria at all. And that actually represents about 64% of Latinos enrolled in college today are at open access institutions. So it makes sense that we talk about those institutions. That's where the majority of Latinos are. And if we're not talking about those institutions, we're talking about a subset that are known as Hispanic serving institutions. And 62% of Latinos in higher ed today are enrolled at Hispanic serving institutions. The majority of these institutions are open access, but there are a couple of selective institutions as well. So the conversations in public policy are often focused on these kinds of institutions, which are very important in the kind of education they provide. Rarely do we talk about the institutions that are the most selective. I think often in our head we think about, the Ivies, the 8 institutions that dominate so much of our public policy discourse. We think about that traditional student enrolled in a traditional pathway in a traditional institution. And that's like less than 18% of all students today, but that's still the mindset we have in public policy. So linking our understanding of where Latino students are and where we think in a public policy lens and where we might want them to be has been a challenge in figuring out how do we frame a conversation that we hope goes way beyond this piece. If we just did this piece and that was it, I think that would be wouldn't contribute as much as we need to think about where Latinos are. When we have conversations, we're thinking often about, if we think about Latinos in selective institutions, it's this idea of the undermatching. Why aren't more Latinos going, right? And we're not going to get into undermatch conversation unless you want to talk about that after the presentation, because this paper is not about that. I think often that sets a false paradigm, that something it's about what students choose and what students do, and those are important conversations. But we wanted to focus on what institutions do, and maybe more what they could do by looking at the most selective institutions and try to frame a conversation that's a little bit different than the college knowledge of students or their limitations or their choices that they're making. Let's focus some on the institutions and what they could be doing to serve our students better. So that's the context I wanted to give you as we think about the kind of information I'm going to share here and hopefully the conversation that we can have in this room and that will follow afterwards. I think this is too important a focus to let go and then revert back to thinking about solely open access, but thinking about opportunities for Latino students. So with that context, I already gave you a little bit of data. I wanted to focus on why we picked the most selective institutions. So we used Barron's Index, for those of you that are researchers and pay attention to that, as a way of identifying the most selective institutions. Other researchers, it's pretty well known for doing that. Using that criteria, 10% of institutions in this country today meet the most selective criteria, 503 institutions. So we have over 4,200 institutions, of which 10%, 503 about, are the most selective. So already we narrow it down significantly from where a lot of students enroll. But we wanted to give a visual of the data, because often I'll just give the data out. But what we see is that 12% of Latinos enrolled in education today are at the most selective institutions. And while that number isn't great, what we see is that number has been increasing. And so while we still have a lot of work to do to get more Latinos college ready, more Latinos are becoming college ready and the ability to compete in the most selective institutions. So we could do more. We don't want to forget the point that we are doing better. There is greater representation. We saw this when we looked at the 4 institutions in greater detail. When we asked them why is it that students are going there, why is their number of Latinos increased? And part of it is a story that there is more college readiness. So we don't want to forget that, although we have quite a ways to go. But looking at this number, it's pretty clear. We see 52% of Latinos are at 2-year institutions, 48% are at four-year institutions. And the most selective are a subset of four-year, by the way. So when we put that little caveat down there for those of you that pay attention. But this is not a separate set of institutions. It's just drilling down a little bit deeper. So 12% of Latino students compared to 17% of all. And go quickly to the graduation rates. And I think most of you in this room, I know, who follow higher education know that graduation rates are great. It's a great metric for looking at first-time, full-time freshmen enrolled full-time and completing within 150% time. And that sounds nerdy, but what it basically is that profile of a traditional student, right? And these are great metrics for those students, and most of them are at selective institutions. So it's a very appropriate measure. It has some challenges at open access institutions where students transfer, stop out, and return, but it's a good metric. And when we look at that metric just at Latinos at the most selective institutions, this is why it matters that Latinos are at the most selective institutions, right? The Latino graduation rate at two-year institutions is 17%. At four-year institutions overall, it's 47%. At the most selective institutions, it's 68%. So there are things here, and what I'm hoping that we will be seeding in your thinking and questions is, what is it? Is it just the selectivity that determines this, or are there other things at the institutional level and the student level we need to be paying attention to? Now, again, when you look at these rates, they're not quite as high as all students, but when you look at Latinos amongst themselves, there's a significant difference in their graduation rate at the most selective institutions. All right. So, we wanted to take a look deeper at these data. And, we don't have these conversations in public policy, but when you look at the admit rates, this is the institutions admit students, and they can choose to enroll or not enroll. But the interesting takeaway from this is that the lower the admit rate, the higher the graduation rate. So that's an issue of selectivity that's pretty clear, right? So community colleges have a 100% admit rate. If you show up, you're enrolled. Right? That's why they're open access. Their graduation rate is 17%, but 100% admit. And at the most selective institutions, about 48% admit rate and 68% grad rate for Latinos, but 74% overall. So there is something to selectivity here, right? The more selective, the more likely they are to complete. And the data bear that out. I think some of us know that intuitively, or we think we know it intuitively. But to have data that support it and sussed out to look at Latinos as a subset is really important. These aren't the conversations we generally have, but that are, need to be thinking in our head as to why this might be the case. So we took a look. So we looked at selectivity. We also looked at costs and expenses. How much are institutions spending on students? And what we found was pretty interesting, and this I hadn't heard very often when I paid attention, that when you look at the proportion of expenditures per student, this is full-time equivalent, the proportion that institutions spend on core activities are actually pretty similar. Whether you're at a two-year institution or you're at the most selective institution, about 40% of an institution's expenditures are in instruction, okay? And an additional 12% or so are spent on student support services and about 10% on academic support services. So that we found pretty interesting across institution type. So where's the difference? It's really in how much money they have. It's one thing to look as a proportion. It's another to look at absolute amounts of money, right? So you look at the most selective institutions, it spends $36,000 per FTE, full-time equivalent student, compared to $28,000 at four-year, $13,000 at two-year institutions. That's significant. I would not argue that money alone is what matters. But when you look at the proportions being the same, and you see that variance in amount invested, you've got to think that that has an impact too in how much we spend and what we see in grad rates. And the fact that they're directly correlated, you can see the admit rate, you see the grad rate, and you look at the amount of expenses, just makes us think selectivity matters, investment and expense matters. But we're pushing to say what more matters. It can't just be that. Do we just give from a public policy level, quadruple the money to two-year institutions and we're going to see this kind of grad rate? I think those of us that work in the space know that it's not as simple as saying it's just that. But it's important that we understand what's going on here. So I'm trying to be tight in time, so again, I'm just giving you the facts. But we try to look a little bit deeper because it really is, what are the institutions doing? And we didn't do a representative sampling of all institutions that were the most selective. We chose to look in California. And what we wanted to do was to get some description. We wanted to put some meat on the bones, right? If the data tell us what we think we know, what helps to explain it in a more meaningful way? So we chose California because we know there's a little bit of control there in terms of context, demographics, public policy issues, and try to get a sense of what institutions were doing. So we picked 2 private and 2 public institutions. So University of Laverne, which is an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution, and Stanford University, not an HSI. And then 2 public institutions, University of California, Santa Barbara, and UC Berkeley. And Santa Barbara is an HSI. Again, this is more for descriptive rather than saying this is fully representative of institutions. But we know we need to have more in-depth conversations about what institutions are doing and how that might be translated to other institutions or that we could learn from or maybe stop doing. And that was the intent in taking a look at these institutions overall. So just a little bit profile of them before we get to the institutional strategies, which is where I hope we'll then can have conversations and reaction. So just, I don't know how many of you are aware of these institutions. These are all Barron's Index, the most selective institutions. And many people, when we put the University of Laverne, are surprised to know that Laverne is considered one of the most selective. And Laverne was surprised. We verified with Barron's Index, though. And we saw some very interesting things and strategies of what they were doing. But they are almost 50% student body is Latino, and it's in Southern California. Stanford, 16% Latino. Santa Barbara, 25%. Actually, they're 26 now, but they just hit that HSI threshold. And Berkeley is 13% Latino. So you see variance in enrollment. For us, that was important because we're not trying to be representative, but we're saying, given this variance in a state that has the most Latino in higher education today, what are we seeing in their strategies and efforts? And it's important that we see this variance of the most selectives, right? And so two public and private. And we took a look at admit versus grad rates. What are we seeing? Again, this is context for the institutional strategies. So at Laverne, you see about 47% admit rate, 55% grad rate. Look at Stanford, 5% admit rate, 93% grad rate. Significant. And wait till we pair it with expenses. You'll see that in a minute. But, so selectivity still matters at these institutions significantly, right? And enrollment matters when we look at these institutions. At the UCs that we chose, Santa Barbara and Berkeley, we still significant variance there too. And the Latino grad rate is lower, slightly lower than all of them, but still significantly higher than if they were somewhere else, right? It's important we pay attention to that. So here are some expenses here. And this is not, we triple check this, right, Morgan? Stanford. Average expenses per full-time equivalent. At Stanford, $220,000 per full-time equivalent. As opposed to Laverne, $14,000, that's below the most selective. Santa Barbara and Berkeley. And we started mapping out other institutions. They're all over the map. So money matters, but maybe that explains the completion rate. It's one of the interesting things when we were talking to colleagues there at Stanford, he said, if a student decides they need to step away, they will hold not just their seat, but their whole financial aid package until that student decides to return. And so an institution that has this kind of resources has the ability to do that kind of thing, right? Are you saying you agree or you have a question? Oh. Yes.
What do the expenses comprise?
So instruction, student support services, academic support, research, and where you see the privates have significant investment in research, actually Berkeley and Stanford speaks to a lot of this, whereas Laverne and Santa Barbara don't have the amount. And then there are other core expenses, but those are actually the 4 largest expenses that we see across. Yeah. Yes?
Is that per year or for?
No, that's per year. These are expenses per year per full-time equivalent student. Yeah, and this is all public data from the U.S. Department of Education iPads that we pulled. So you see already big differences we're paying attention to here. The last thing, because I know I'm tight on time here too, but hopefully I've spurred a lot more questions because that's what this should be about, is thinking about what were they actually doing and serving Latino students. So we talked to a wide breadth of people at these institutions to get a handle on it. And you'll see more information in the publication. I hope you'll take a look. We drill down for each one of them. But But what we found interesting, so these are our core takeaways, is that they use financial aid as a tool for retention, not just for access. And that might sound trite, but I think in a lot of institutions we deal with, once you've got them in the door, it's, que vayan con Dios, it's up to them to get through. We got you in, it's up to you to get through. And what we see is these institutions are using financial aid. Now, many of them have institutional aid to the point where they can invest beyond that. But it is interesting to think about financial aid as a retention tool, not just an access tool. Second, they use community and alumni efforts to target Latinos for outreach and engagement. And this is often for recruitment and others. So it's not just the institution. They've created a social capital and environment that does a lot of the work for the institution on their behalf. So it creates kind of this linked community. It's not that we don't see it elsewhere, but it was very strong in the institutions we talked to here that are the most selective. And in the same way, we were kind of intrigued. There was one exception, but they used they fostered a sense of community with the Latinos that were on campus, often using their Chicano and Latino offices to make that happen. There was one exception where the Chicano and Latino office, Chicano Latino office, was not actively involved, and there was some serious tension there. We don't go into any of that in our paper because what we're really focused on is what they're doing that's constructive. But overall, there was a real engagement and a sense of community in these institutions. The other is they all used focus on undergraduate research as a way to include their students in the academic rigor, but also in the support structure. So you see a lot of Latinos who go on to graduate education have been at these selective institutions because they've been exposed to undergraduate research. And then they also go back to their alumni for employment opportunities. Not surprising, we hear about selective institutions, and it's the network that comes with that you're able to tap into to say that you're a graduate of Stanford. You connect more immediately with other Stanford graduates. So, but that it's an overt, explicit part. I know when, for example, we were talking with Berkeley, and we actually at Excelencia had a couple positions open, and they reached out and took our position description on their own and posted it on their grad site for all their graduates to see. Didn't ask us, we didn't send it to them. They were actively searching for opportunities for their graduates that they could make them aware of to increase their employment opportunities. And that's significantly different than what we see in a lot of open access and other institutions. And then finally here, and again, there's a lot more in the paper, but we saw an interesting approach. Rather than having outreach and engagement efforts centralized in one office, it was really dispersed within disciplines. So the STEM office, or the history office or others, they actually were very engaged in the recruitment and support of the students at the disciplinary level rather than just at the institutional level. And that created that sense of community and connection for a lot of students in their discipline, but also amongst each other, that I think was a value added from what we've seen in open access institutions we work with. So I think I hit within my time. Hopefully that was interesting. There's a lot more in the paper that you should see, but I hope that's enough to start our colleagues in a conversation about the most selective institutions. What is it we know, and what are institutions doing rather than just students alone and their strategies? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Gilbert Cisneros. I'm the president of the Gilbert and Jacki Cisneros Foundation. And, I wrote a speech, but I don't think I'm going to say any of it. But like SARITA said, it's been about 6 years now since I was lucky enough to win that, purchase that ticket. And since then, I've kind of been on a road of discovery about education and really trying to help Latino students. It first kind of started out in our hometown trying to help kids get into college. But I just didn't want to kind of like she said as well, I just didn't really want to do something where I just thought, oh, well, let's do this and kind of throw money at it. I wanted to be sure I knew what I was doing and be able to talk about things. So I did a lot of research, and I found out that a lot of Latinos were going to community college, nearly about half of them, or maybe a little bit more. But and a lot of them weren't moving on beyond that. They weren't graduating, they weren't transferring, they weren't really going on to get their bachelor's degree, which is, for me and my wife is really what we feel is the ultimate goal of what we want kids to do when they go and achieve at least the beginning of their college education. And so we initially started a scholarship program, and because of that fact, we kept it pretty much to four-year colleges and universities. And nobody applied for our scholarship. So, it's where we kind of got into a thing like, okay, well, why is this happening? And it just, there was really no expectation for a lot of these kids to go on and move on to four-year colleges or universities. They were just kind of stuck in that this is what they did. As over time, as like I said, I would kind of dive into this. I started looking into this more. Okay, well, why is this happening? And then we found out that a lot of kids were, as they were mentioned, were going to Hispanic serving institutions, which themselves did not have very successful graduation rates. And, then we thought, well, why does it, they all tend to kind of go there? Why wouldn't they go to more selective universities where, if you look at the data, they seem to be graduating a lot more. So that is what kind of took me to Excelencia in education that kind of began our conversation as to, how do we move to get to where we can have students kind of realize, not only students, but faculty, educators, politicians, realize that, maybe the track that we should be kind of moving and kind of guiding students towards is not necessarily the Hispanic serving institutions, but more selective colleges and universities. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand that not everybody's going to be able to go to a Stanford or to a UC Santa Barbara, and these schools are pretty difficult to get into. But the one thing that I think it does mention in the report is that more Latinos now are, there's been great strides in education for Latinos. More are graduating from high school than at any other time. More are going to colleges. More are getting accepted into these more selected universities than they have at any other time. So it's not that they necessarily that we can't get in there. It's just a lot of times students kind of choose not to attend these universities and colleges. And we need to kind of work, as I think, within our community to kind of change that and to kind of get them going on the right path. Our goal is with the kids that we work with is that we want them to go to the best college that they are academically qualified to attend. Because I think the data is going to show you that is going to help them be successful. That's what's going to help them go and achieve that bachelor's degree. That's what's going to allow them to help them build their network and to kind of move on and be successful in their careers. So that is our goal, and that is one of the things that we kind of strive to do with this project here, to help students kind of realize that, as well as educators and politicians and parents. So, Deborah said this report isn't really about undermatching, but undermatching tends to be one of my favorite subjects. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit and kind of how I think it kind of relates to this presentation. So a couple weeks ago, I sit on the board of this organization in Santa Ana, California. And those of you that don't know Santa Ana, California, it's a city of over, it's a pretty large city in Orange County, California. It's with about over 300,000 people in the city, and 80% of them are Latino. So very large Latino community there. And this organization I'm on the board of, they recently joined. They haven't even been on there a year yet, but they do great work, and they've done great work for years, and they have kind of evolved over time. They've really kind of started out as a program that they created this program to really, at the beginning, was to get kids off the street. And then it kind of evolved into, well, let's help them graduate, high school. And now they've kind of moved on to well, now we need to help them get into college. So every year they have an event that celebrates the students that complete this program, and some of them start this program as early as the second and third grade, so they're in it for many years. And as I'm sitting at my table there and I'm looking at the program, I got very excited. They had a list of colleges. There were a lot of colleges there that were listed, selective universities and colleges that these kids got into. But then, a part of the program was for that day was that the kids would come out, they would introduce themselves, and they would say where they were going to school. So as I was kind of looking to see, match up the child or the kid, the student with this colleges that were listed in the program, I just kept hearing community college after community college after community college. And it kind of really, almost, I don't want to say like it was a dagger in the heart, but it was kind of saddening to know, because if you kind of look at this report and this kind of talks about it, and Deborah just kind of talked about it now, is those kids, the chances of graduating that go on and move to that, going to that community college is really going to decrease their chances of actually going on and graduating and getting a bachelor's degree. So again, it's one thing I think to kind of read it in a report, but to kind of see it right there in front of you as they were doing was kind of gut-wrenching at the time. So that's one of the reasons why I think this report is important, because we need to realize what it does, or what the benefit of these students attending selective universities and how important it can be to them, and how it can basically change the trajectory of their life. So the other reason why I think this is important, and this will kind of be the last thing I say, is that the president in 2009 made a speech about how he wanted the United States to be the most educated nation in the world again. Well, the only way that's going to happen is if the Latino community starts getting more educated and attending college and getting degrees. Georgetown did a report not that long ago that said by 2018, 63% of the workforce is going to require people to have some college. And with our growing population in the Hispanic community, that we are that workforce. We are going to replace the aging workforce that is beginning to retire, and most of those people that will be entering the job market will be Latino. So in order to do that successfully, we need to educate our community and have them ready for their future. And this is why I talk to a lot of people, and maybe I'm being dramatic at times, I think they are, but it's actually a national crisis is what I see this is, because if we don't start to work and we don't start to go and educate our population, then it's only going to hurt our economy, and it's only going to hurt the nation going into the future. So this is why I think this report is so important. At some point I hope that we can get to a point to where, whatever path you choose to take, will lead to success. But right now, I think the path that we're showing, that the data shows that is the most successful, is to help these kids get into selective universities and colleges. And like I said, I know it's not possible for everybody, but we got to encourage these kids. We got to encourage these students, the parents, to let them know that we want the students to go to the school that they are most qualified to go to, because that's going to lead them to success. So it's not going to help their family, it's going to help our community, and it's going to help our country. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michele Siqueiros. I just want to thank Excelencia for always doing, I think, really important research. Our focus at the Campaign for College Opportunity is on California, so it's always good learning for me to see what data you're finding, what lessons you're learning, and how we can apply them to influence public policy in our own state. Excelencia's work is important, I think, for a lot of the reasons that Gilbert shared. The future of the country, certainly the future of California, is going to depend on our ability to educate Latinos across the nation. There's just no other way to talk about the urgency of that. And while the Campaign for College Opportunities focus is not Latinos, you cannot be an organization in California that cares about the future of our state and not be thinking strategically about the future of Latinos. I think it's pretty clear that the economic need for a more educated workforce has never been more pronounced in our own state, where it's projected that we are going to be 1.1 million bachelor's degrees short of what the workforce requires. So this isn't just, we want more Latinos to go to college because we think it's a good thing, but actually workers are expected now to have a college education. The value of a college degree has never been higher. And report after report can provide you with the data that shows the increased buying power, earning power, value of a college degree for every single person that has one. And the growing inequality in our country is pretty much aligned with those that are educated and have a degree versus those that are not. So I think this issue is incredibly important. You know, the growth that Deborah and Gilbert spoke of, you know, we have more Latinos than ever before earning a high school degree, eligible for college, applying to college, enrolling in college, completing college. Those are all the things that we're incredibly proud of. Yet I like to quote a Texan friend of mine who says, that's like the rooster taking credit for the sunrise. The reality is that the demographic growth of our population is so huge that you would, of course, expect that there's going to be growth in Latinos getting a high school degree, applying for college, enrolling in college. It's still very clear that the growth, though, is not proportional to our numbers in the population. So in California, while you have more and more Latinos eligible for college, they're certainly not represented in any of the segments in the numbers of their population. And even though Latinos disproportionately go to community college, even there, they're not proportionally represented. So in our state, you know, you'd have to be at about 50% of your student body should be Latino. So the University of La Verne doesn't enroll too many Latinos. It actually enrolls as many Latinos as it should be enrolling, considering the population of our state. Every single other campus is not enrolling enough Latinos. I think one of the reports that you can get on your way out that we released in November was called Access Denied. And much like SARITA and Deborah and Gilbert's conversation around what's going on with Latinos at colleges that are highly selective, that report started from a conversation with my own staff about the frustration that we were all lamenting that we would never get into college today, or that we certainly wouldn't have got into, you know, in my case, Pitzer College or UC San Diego, my colleague's case, Brown University, other UC campuses. I think this real feeling that somehow 20 years ago, it was a lot easier for us to get into college than it is for students today. And so anecdotally, we knew that. You know, we talk a lot about eligibility as if eligibility is something that's stagnant, that doesn't change. Well, eligibility changes every year depending on what an institution wants eligibility to be defined as. And so in Access Denied, we talk about how at the University of California, eligibility has continuously gone up and up and up and gotten higher and higher. And I don't think we would all say that you should have to have a 4.2 GPA, that you should get an almost near perfect score on your SAT in order to be college material. But that's actually the case at most UC campuses today. So the most affordable option for a selective and incredible public university system is primarily out of reach for most students because it is nearly impossible to get in. And if any of you know any young people that are in high school today, and you talk to them for a few minutes, you realize how stressed out they are and how they don't feel that there's any chance that they can get into a UC campus, and how many AP courses they're taking, how they don't have free time for any volunteer work or anything else, even though they have to do that to be considered, for college as well. The level, I think, of stress that we're putting on young people today is really incredible. And I think one of the points we wanted to make in Access Denied is that that's not necessary and that it's not fair. That really it shouldn't be okay for us to put this kind of burden on young people that we didn't have to experience ourselves. And certainly if you go back 40 years, that folks in that generation didn't have to experience to that extent. You know, the reason for this increased competitiveness, though, is a reality of insufficient state funding in California's case, and that has repercussions, right? So last year was a good year, for higher education funding in our state. I think we've recovered from the recession, and so a lot of new enrollment funding was given to the University of California and the Cal State system and community colleges. And our point is that it's still insufficient. It's still not enough to keep up with demand. In our state, we are still saying only the top third of students that graduate from high school should go to a four-year university, even though the workforce requires almost half of students, or half of the employees to have some college education. So there's a complete mismatch and disconnect with reality in the 21st century in terms of what is required. And as my director of policy research likes to remind me, the surest path for someone to earn a four-year degree is for them to start at a four-year university. And that has been part of why we've been champions for how do you expand access and funding for four-year universities? How do you make sure that this level of competitiveness is talked about and addressed, that we don't just take it for granted, that it's competitive and that's just the way it is and we can't do anything about it? And how do we push for a much more effective community college system in light of, the fact that we direct so many students to the community colleges? How do we make sure that transfer actually works so that they can get from the community college to a four-year university if that's their intent? And we know that that is the intent for most students. I'll just end by saying that, like Deborah, I think we care a lot about completion, and that this isn't just a conversation about getting into college if we're not talking about graduation from college. Thank you, welcome. So obviously the report talks about the kind of support and guidance that's necessary and that ensures students do complete. And that's important for all institutions to learn from and to actually implement in their own colleges and universities, because it's not enough to just receive students if you can't provide them with the kind of environment that makes them feel at home and that ensures that they get to graduation. As I mentioned, I'm a proud graduate of Pitzer College. Around the time I was admitted, the admission rate was probably around the 40 percentile rate. I'm proud to announce that my niece was just admitted to Pitzer College, and obviously she's way smarter and brighter than me because their admit rate this year was about 12%. So while I'm grateful for her, and we're grateful for all the students that get the opportunity to go to selective colleges that we know are going to launch them for future success, we need to make sure that more of our students have that opportunity, and that all of these colleges are held accountable for serving the population in their states and in their cities. So with that, thank you again, Excelencia, for the good work that you do.
So for continuity, we've had an opportunity to look at the highlights of the analysis itself. We've heard from our benefactor, Gil Cisneros, about why the subject is important, why his personal commitments have compelled him to make this kind of investment, and what it is that he hopes that will come from it. Michele Siqueiros has talked about the state of education in California, the impact of the flow of Latino talent, or the absence of it, through institutions in the state of California. And throughout all of this, you have heard the introductions of each and every one of our panelists, including our final panelist, Dr. Ruiz, who is a member of the House of Representatives. And I had the opportunity to share with them your background, not only your experience in Coachella and your district, but also your pursuit of a medical degree and how you are the first Latino to earn 3 degrees from Harvard University. I think that's a selective institution. So with that, I would like to turn things over to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's exciting to be here today. I took a red eye just to be here because this topic is so important to me. It's a topic that's going to define us as a country, it's define us as a community. It's going to define our future because we know the demographics. I'm sure everybody has talked about them here, and the growing population, Latino population, the younger age in our communities that's going to sustain all of our social programs, Medicare, Social Security, as well as be the future workforce of America. Thank you to SARITA for the kind introduction and for your work to improve educational outcomes for Latino students across our nation. Thank you, Deborah, for setting the stage for the discussion today. I also want to thank my friend Gil Cisneros and the Gilbert and Jacki Cisneros Foundation for partnering with the other great institutions here to make this study possible. And thank you, Excelencia. This topic is very important, as you know. Education is one of the social determinants of health. I'm an emergency medicine physician, public health expert, training in humanitarian disaster aid, and one of the most important determinants of whether you live a life of wellness, whether you suffer certain ailments in your life, whether you live longer, is your educational background. Your ability to get that job, get a career, get the health insurance that you need, the ability to have leisure time because you're not working 2 or 3 part-time jobs from 8 to 10 p.m., and therefore that leisure time gives you the ability to exercise and go to the gym, and the ability to problem solve and make wise choices of the foods you eat, the activities you undertake, the hobbies that you decide to have. So when patients come into my emergency department, usually when they're adolescents or younger, junior high school, I tell my students in medicine and the residents that asking the patient what college they're going to is just as important or even more important than asking them their social history of whether or not they smoke cigarettes and how many cigarettes or how many drinks do they have a week. You all been to the doctor, you know we have to ask those questions, right? Because that question of where you're going to go to college is not only going to determine my patient's longevity, and these are, you know, high school kids as well, but it's going to determine the longevity of their parents' lives, of their whole entire family's life. And that's important for us to recognize as well. I know a little bit about education, just from my personal life story. I remember when I was growing up in the trailer parks in Coachella. My parents were farm workers, for those of you that don't know. We grew up poor in a trailer in the earlier parts of my life. And I remember my mother telling me, son, you have to go to school. Necesitas ir a la escuela. You have to study. Before anything else, you got to study. Why, Mama? Because I want you to get a job indoors in air conditioning rather than outdoors in 120-degree weather, bending over, picking crops, like your dad and me. And then it wasn't until I was a little older when I saw how she was just a wonderful angel in the community. The neighbors would come to her asking her, where can they get cheap medicine that's affordable? Where can they go see the doctor for this and that? And I really admired that about my mother until today. She would give the shirt off her back to anyone who needs one. And so when she asked me, son, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, well, Mom, what do you call those like you that help others? And she was smart. She said, a doctor. She said, a doctor, son. So I said, okay, I'm going to be a doctor so I can help others and help the community. So I had that in my mind, and I was a very stubborn kid, so I was going to be a doctor. So I grew up in the farm worker community, always saying I was going to be a doctor. And my older brother was the first to graduate from high school, and it was a high school counselor of mine who paid for my college application to Stanford, and my brother's friend paid for my college application to UCLA. I guess those two schools are considered selective schools. And but I had only applied to two because that's all we could afford. And I mean, my friends paid for my college applications. And I went to UCLA, but my parents couldn't afford school, like many of our Latino families and working poor families can't afford an education. And so what I did is, and I know some of you know the story, but I put on the only suit I owned, and it was one of those itchy suits I hate to wear. I used to wear it on the weekends to church, and I bought it 2 sizes larger so I grow into as an investment. But nobody told me at the age of 17 I wasn't going to grow much anymore. So it fit me awkward. And I borrowed a briefcase so I can look as professional as possible, like a businessman. And it was the summer of 1990. It was about 115 degrees outside. And I walked from store to store with this itchy blue suit, sweating. I'd walk in, I'd put my briefcase down to draw attention in front of the clerk or the store owner, and I'd open my briefcase and I'd pull out my contract and I'd hand it over to the business owner or the clerk, whoever would listen. I would say, I'm offering you an opportunity to invest in your community by investing in my education, because I promise you I will be a doctor and I will come home to serve the community. So I made a social contract, a literal contract, and I got $20, $40 here and there. I got a whole lot of sorry sons, times are tough, but in between I got a few hundreds. So I raised $2,000 that summer, which paid for 2 years worth of school books back then. Now it's a little different. But it was more than the $20 bills that mattered to me. It was the fact that I had a purpose in my life. It was the fact that I was following my dream that was fueled by my mission to fight for health equity and social justice. It was the fact that I saw so much suffering and poverty and struggle. I saw calloused hands and tired backs. I saw the fear and anxiety of not having enough to eat or not being able to get the latest clothing for your children in my parents' eyes because they couldn't afford the things that the other kids could have. Or perhaps I saw people that went without health care, family that just took the pain because they couldn't afford the emergency department. That fueled my desire to get that education so that I can become a doctor and come home and serve the community. So I went to UCLA, and UCLA had a program called AAP, Academic Advancement Program, where it was a lot of the underrepresented students who were mentors and provided tutorials for the underclassmen to get ahead. And that was very, very, very helpful to me, because we have obstacles throughout the entire chain of our education. The first obstacle in my experience was the fact that my parents didn't have a high school education. I was first generation college student. So I didn't have people to ask about college or applications or how to prepare or what does it look like. I have family members to tell me what it was going to be like in college and how do I think straight so that I can make it in college. And then the financial aid, which is a big barrier for us, not only before we go to college, but also after college, so that those are the obstacles that prevent us from accumulating capital for us to help our communities in a greater scale because of the student debt that we all own as professionals. Then when you're in school, we oftentimes might come from an underperforming high school. In my high school, the dropout rate was over 50%. It was about 60, 65%. So I remember taking AP English and getting an A in the class, but having to take remedial English in college because I didn't know how to write a real essay, right? So these are the dilemmas that communities often that from low resource, students that come from low resource communities face when they go into college. And so the attrition rate is something that we have to look at to make sure that we have the right social support services, the academic support services, the right mentorship, the right leadership, the right motivational experiences that our students have so that they see themselves as part of a solution to the greater good and not just going to get a job or getting an education to get a job, but to know that our students have a role in the greater puzzle of a more just society in our time and in the future. So from there, you know the rest of the story. I went to Harvard Medical School, Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard School of Public Health. They wrote an article saying I was first Latino to get 3 graduate degrees from Harvard University. Because there's a lot of undergrads that then go get a master's and a PhD from there and stuff. But nonetheless, I went back home to fulfill that promise. And the first place I started working was in farm worker trailer parks, giving free health education, free service, started free clinics, led a healthcare initiative to address the healthcare access barriers, organized a free flu vaccine for the most vulnerable seniors, especially after H1N1 virus hit the desert really hard. And I started a Future Physician Leaders program, which took high school and college kids from underserved communities who want nothing more than to be doctors and go back and serve in their communities so that they can improve the health of their communities. And I really turned that program into a program that really reflected my experience. In other words, those barriers that I talked to you about earlier, these kids, these students, have similar experiences that their parents didn't finish high school. So I knew that as a professional, I have the responsibility to provide the social capital that they would not have otherwise had that I didn't have growing up. So I invited them to the emergency department, and because I was a physician, I asked my colleagues, the cardiologists, the neurosurgeons, the internists, the family physicians, hey, can my student shadow you for a couple hours? Hey, can you talk to my student about what you're seeing on the CAT scan? Hey, can you have lunch with this student who's interested in being a pediatrician? Can you take them out to lunch, you know, and I'll cover the costs. You know, they're usually, no big deal, I'll cover it as well. So I became a connector using my social capital to augment theirs and their voice. It's sort of what I'm doing now as a congressman, huh? And then what I did is I gave them some tools and skills on how to conduct community health projects, how to conceive of the idea, how to write a budget, how to formulate a team to get community partners, how to implement their project, and then how to measure the value. These are things that one doesn't learn until they're in public health school or until they're 3rd, 4th year in medical school, and these are high school kids. And I sent them out to the community to do it on their own. And they did. So when you give them the confidence, when you give them the skills, when you let them have the life experience that they need, when they start to see that they have value in their studies and their work, and that they transform their knowledge into active service for the community, then great things happen. Then you see their eyes light up. Then they start believing in themselves. Then those that maybe were having trouble graduating from high school, graduated from high school, and now they're going to college. Those that were thinking they weren't going to make it in college are now graduating with honors. Just because they see the difference that an education, training, knowledge can have not only in their personal lives, but in the lives of their communities and the lives of their families. And then if that wasn't enough, they would shadow physicians in their practice. The idea that they can see what they wanted to become. They can see themselves in the physician's role and say, I can do that. Because we don't have that very routinely in our communities. We don't know a lot of physicians or engineers or lawyers because we're underrepresented in those professions as well. But when they're there and they can see and they can have that connect and social capital, then you develop that mentorship, then you develop that purpose in life, then you develop the tools and skills that they need to get ahead, and then we provide those experiences that they need in order to compete with anybody else who's also applying to medical school. So those are just some reflections from my life and my story and what I've done to help kids and students and fellows and medical students and residents to continue to believe in themselves, to progress with an education. An education is the great equalizer. An education will help you compete, will help you have a voice, will help you amplify the social causes that you believe in, regardless of your background. And I'm living proof. And I use my education to amplify the issues that I believe in, to help connect the communities that I care about with their social capital, to make sure that my rigor in academia and studies and the science will help me use evidence-based policies to advance our causes and to be able to make sure that we are doing things right for the right reasons and for the right causes. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank this entire panel for contributing to what now is a framework for the discussion. And with that, it is really the floor to you for questions in terms of additional ideas, aspects of it that you would like to ferret out. And if all else fails, Deborah will double down on the practices within selective institutions, because really that's where this conversation is driving. Yes?
Two questions.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. My Alexandra Reyes, I work at Pearson. Sorry about the because of the books, we are working on that. You know, your study about the selectivity. I have a 16-year-old who is starting the process of getting to, and he's so nervous, he stopped with the exam. He said, Mommy, impossible. 30% perfect scores plus 4.2% GPA. So I said, apply. I mean, that's okay. But those criteria that makes the students not be perfect, right? And when you don't have the background, it's not that they don't have being smart, it's just that they don't have the environment that help them develop all the skills and all the things that they need. And second, so that for me, how are you going to translate that into discussing at the university level on those issues, and at the selectivities, how are you bringing them to us? So how can we translate your study into, okay, the staff from the Harvard, the MIT, come and take from these wonderful pool of students to your university? How we can do that?
Okay, I'll jump in.
So I think this is one of the reasons we chose to focus on the institutions and what institutions could do is because we do find really strong academically qualified students who don't know the opportunities that are out there. And while students have an absolute responsibility in their families to find these opportunities, we don't want to let institutions off the hook. And they need to find these students as well. So I'm reinforcing your second question, which is our focus is what can institutions do better to serve these students? And we found many selective institutions, they can just sit back and wait. because there's so many students that are applying. I mean, one of the reasons the admit rates at these institutions are so low is because they get so many students who apply. And that's a challenge for the institutions in another area. So what can we do? We can push institutions to say, you have to make sure you're intentional in serving Latinos. It's not good enough to say, we exist, let them come to us. You have to have intentional practices. So part of what we saw was the efforts by some of these selective institutions to be more explicit in reaching out to the Latino community and Latino students, using their alumni and connecting them with work and research as a way to engage them. And I think that's really helped to sustain or retain them to completion. So we need to do more of that. And I think part of our commitment at Excelencia is to make sure we're working with institutions to push that envelope. I think the second part is on the student side. And we would partner with institutions and organizations who are doing this, which is working directly with students, organizations like Hispanic Scholarship Fund, the kind of work that the Campaign for College Opportunity is doing with institutions, with policymakers, and with communities to make sure that they see the opportunities, that they don't choose not to apply, which that's a double negative, that they choose to apply, let's put it that way, to these selective institutions, despite what we see on paper. Because I think too often we stop ourselves from seizing an opportunity because we don't think we're worthy, capable, or can afford it. And we deal a lot in financial aid, and we've seen a lot of students, actually data show us that many students who go to community colleges and go part-time would actually get more financial aid and pay less if they went to a four-year institution and enrolled full-time. Because of their income level, they would get more financial aid. But when students are making choices based on sticker price as opposed to financial aid, we're finding their pathways to persistence are lower. So there is a lot of work that still needs to go on in our communities with our students, but I think for us it has to be with institutions as well. We can't just leave it up to the Latino population alone to do its work.
I think the two things I would add to what Deborah shared is that, we have to be advocates for more state funding for higher education. I mean, institutions that, like the University of California, are not going to be able to serve more students unless they actually have the funding to do it. But I would say also hold them accountable. I think, they will tell you that they're willing to grow if the state gives them more money, but they like to grow in very small, measured ways, and I think we have to push them to make sure that they grow in ways that actually serve our community. And I would say, obviously in California, we have a ban on the use of affirmative action, but we support using affirmative action, and it would be great to repeal the ban on affirmative action. I think if we're going to try and get more rapidly into a place where more Latinos and African American and underrepresented students can access a four-year education, then affirmative action is one incredibly great way to do that. In light of that not being the case, I can't wave my magic wand. I would say that we have to address really how do we grow the number of low-income students and students that don't have the opportunity and the resources, or parents who put them into courses where they can prepare for the SAT, where they have all of these other supports and opportunities that many first-generation students simply don't have. And how do we make sure that colleges and universities really value that grit and the circumstance of overcoming quite a few obstacles that a lot of students bring to the table, and not just value the fact that wealthy children have quite a bit of support and opportunity provided to them that low-income kids simply do not.
Congressman, can I ask you what, in your opinion, Harvard did specifically that helped you? Because you talked a lot about your own grit and ability to get through.
And if you would go to the mic, so.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. It was very interesting because when I interviewed at all the different California medical schools that I got accepted to, everybody was really out there trying to recruit me. And when I went to Harvard, I saw more students there like me from poor farm worker families than anywhere in California. So I really felt a connection with those students that were there that really wanted me to be there, that had a very strong community support, although small, but they were very tight and we were very close to one another. And then the other thing was there's no discounting the importance of those few wonderful people that make you feel like you belong, that make you feel that you bring value to the institution, and that the institution needs you. And I'm talking about Michael Porter, a neuroscientist who did research in a lab, who has worked for increasing diversity in the area, and he knew that a lot of the students that go through these higher education sometimes feel like, did they make a mistake? Am I really supposed to be here? Look at everybody around, right? It's that, what is Sotomayor? Yeah, she called it the imposter syndrome, right? But there's those few champions who really talk to you, take you under their wings and coach you and saying, listen, no way, man. Not only do you belong, but you own the school. They need you. They need you to be who you are, to excel, to be a physician, to be a leader in our community. And I recently, looking back, I recently went to Harvard Medical School and gave the Alvin Poussaint lecture that they have annually, and I talked about health equity and social justice and the importance of diversity in higher education. So it all kind of comes back. And so those mentors in leadership positions are very important. So in colleges, you find those, you make sure they hire those, and that way they're in key positions that will make a difference for the students. And Harvard Medical School is looking for a new dean. So I'm writing a letter to make sure that that dean that they choose have the qualities that, that my mentors had, so that students from all backgrounds can feel very welcomed and that will excel. Thank you.
Any questions?
All that, no provocative questions? Let me add a little bit more of the work here, and one of my colleagues who helped write the piece, Morgan Taylor, is back there as well. Because I think the way in public policy we focus on the data and the numbers, and that tells us, because we focus on scale, right? Policy is about scale. And how do we get to the numbers that tell us it's worth investment and paying attention to? And the numbers of Latinos at the most selective institutions are still low. And the commitment by institutions to focus on Latinos as a way of recruitment is one that takes some real thought and effort, and it takes intentionality, and often it takes resources to do. And we talked to a couple of institutions who struggled, because for them it's relatively easy to get students, and the onus for diversity is on the students and not on the institution. So I wanted to share with you just a couple more examples of the institutions we talked to, and a difference we saw in looking at the HSIs that were selective. And there are only 17 of the 435 institutions that hit the HSI enrollment criteria. 17 of the 435 are considered the most selective institutions. That's 3%. And that speaks to some of the reason that Gil was taking a look and saying, is it HSIs, or would you look at other options? So 3% of HSIs are the most selective. What we found in talking to these HSIs that were selective, only 2, and again, I'm not saying this is representative, but important to consider is they became HSIs because they committed to serving the community where they were enrolled. So it's not that they went out to Coachella from Harvard, from Massachusetts, and said, let me go find a couple of Latinos to bring to Massachusetts. And, but demography was not destiny. I mean, I, in some ways, jokingly say, look, if that were the case, UCLA would have been an HSI a long time ago, right? So I think it's important that we pay attention to demography. There should be greater representation population-wise, but looking at the commitment by the institutions to serve the communities where they are is really important. That's another reason we took a look at California and focused where we did. And those that looked at the community where they were saw an increase because they saw the college-eligible students that were Latino. They were there, they didn't know it until they changed that lens to pay attention to the community around them. And that was important thought. UC Santa Barbara is not considered often, it's a Research 1 institution in Carnegie classification. People don't think about Santa Barbara as where it's located. There's a large Latino population there. It's been a large Latino population for a while. It's known for having lots of wealthy students, but it also has lots of low-income students. And in talking to Santa Barbara, that just hit HSI status last year, they said, we haven't changed our eligibility criteria, but what we found was that as we became more attractive to the community around us, they saw us as an opportunity in ways they hadn't before. They'd worked with the community college in that area, but they'd also invested in that area. And when they saw there was a potential moniker of HSI that might bring more resources to the institution, all of a sudden they thought, we're so close without trying. We're at 22, 23%. What if we tried to bring in more Latinos? And they were actually one of the first institutions that took out media celebrating hitting HSI status, which, for those of you that have tracked that moniker for a while, it's not something that a lot of institutions historically were really proud of, having a concentration of students that are perceived as having great need. So to have an institution that's selective like Santa Barbara say, we're proud to be an HSI, doesn't let them off the hook. They were actually one of the ones we had a lot of challenges with engaging their Chicano studies programs. But what we found was fascinating is that from the administration on down, they were embracing the HSI status. Now, word to deed is otra cosa, right? Michele knows that very well. But the fact that they were willing to be overt and articulate it meant they were creating policy space for action. And we're going to give them credit for that part of it because, we have a lot of people who say, we're just educating all, we don't distinguish. And while that's important, we wouldn't see educational attainment gaps if we were actually educating all. So being intentional doesn't necessarily mean using affirmative action, but being intentional, making sure Latinos are included is part of what we've been focusing on in our strategy and efforts. Anything that our colleagues want to add to Gil? Takeaway? Michele? Congressman?
No, I think
I'm going to hand it back to you.
This release is the beginning of a discussion. We said it began with discussion among the three of us. Now we've broadened the discussion to not only the panel, but all of you. It will continue on social media. Tomorrow there will be a national e-blast that will not only make the brief and other materials available, but the videotape of this session. But it is our best hope that those who care about America's future and recognize that Latino talent is essential to propel us will engage. We're going to strategize how, as it relates to discussion is usually the way it begins, but that's not satisfying. It's action. And now that we've had an opportunity to make common cause with all of you, as well as this panel, please stay tuned, because it is our intention to look at all institutions of higher education, those that we've worked with for some time, and those that are well positioned to then receive, educate, and propel Latino talent. Thank you all for being here with us today. Adelante.